Okay, colleagues, welcome back. So, no time to waste. Let's finish with the Stoics. So, again, wonderful article by Richard Parry. Let's begin. The Stoics are well known for their teaching that the good is to be identified with virtue. By virtue, they mean such moral virtues as justice, moderation, and courage. So, in an important respect, we are talking about something like the traditional definition of the virtues, which are more or less in line with traditional morality. Although some Stoics will have um, certain criticisms, certain deviations from what traditional Greek society and Roman society regarded as moral. Anyway, yeah. By virtue, they mean justice, moderation, courage. So all that is required for happiness, that is the secure possession of the good, of what is needed to make one's life a thoroughly good one. And the only thing is to lead a morally virtuous life. So this is a very contentious, very problematic doctrine that the Stoics have, that virtue is sufficient for happiness. And you see, for the Epicureans, from empirical standpoint, I think it's clear what we're talking about. The Epicurus would say that life of ataraxia is as pleasant as it gets. Absence of desire is as good as satisfaction of desire. This is at least somewhat empirically plausible and empirically verifiable. Very clearly, the criterion is immanent. We're talking about an immanent criterion. The person from within their life should be able to say which state is better, which state is worse. But when the Stoics talk about this seemingly external or transcendent criterion, right, there's this independent, objective criterion of virtue, and virtue is sufficient for happiness, I am not exactly sure what they mean. And this to me, with my Foucauldian background, this sounds suspect. This sounds suspicious. Maybe there are some external values that are that the Stoics are trying to smuggle in, so to speak, through the back door. Again, I think at the end of the day, ultimately, we have to be aware of the challenge of Thrasymachus, of Callicles, and of Critias, who talk about how public morality is simply invented by the strong or maybe by the multitude in order to control the subordinate population or to control the individual. So from the very beginning, I am inclined to be very skeptical of any philosophy that tries to use a transcendent criterion of goodness. So by talking about transcendent and immanent, I mean the immanent criterion is that from within yourself, from within your own soul, from within your own psyche, right? If you don't believe in the soul, you can feel that what you are doing is right. Again, Epicurus says, try. Compare one course of action to another, and you will feel from within yourself that you are doing something that feels better. Again, pleasure naturally feels good, and pain of hangover or pain of craving after drugs, for example, feels bad. So again, Epicurus thinks that his way of life is demonstrably, empirically better. Whereas, so you should be able to demonstrate this to yourself within your own head, right? Whereas for the Stoics, if the criterion is immanent, if it's within the soul, I'm not sure what is the difference then between Stoicism and Epicureanism. And if the criterion is transcendent, if it's external, then I'm not sure how they will be able to argue for it. How can they defend it from the challenge of Thrasymachus, of Callicles, and of Critias? And this is why, again, I have to tell you, so I keep talking about how Epicurus and Sextus are two of my favorite ancient Greek philosophers. Well, the Stoics, I have a lot of questions for Stoics. Stoics, by the way, are very popular nowadays, and I think to some extent for right reasons, but to some extent I'm afraid maybe also for the wrong reasons. Namely, I am broadly speaking, from a Marxist or a Foucauldian perspective. Foucault himself was actually quite sympathetic to the Stoics, but for somebody like Marx, this idea that, you should, again, happiness is sufficient for virtue. Like, if you're born a slave, be a good slave, and this should be sufficient for your happiness. I mean, for Marx, this is more or less the definition of this phrase, how religion is the opium of the people. And in this sense, Stoicism, some forms of Stoicism, I'm afraid, could be taken as, this secular form of religion, although it's a complicated question. Anyway, so all that is required for happiness is virtue. In this teaching, the Stoics are addressing the problem of bodily and external goods raised by Aristotle. So for Aristotle, in order to be happy, you also need to have external goods and goods of the body. You need to be born lucky. And the Stoics are saying, no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what kind of station you're born at. You can be born a lowly, crippled slave, and still your virtue, the excellence of your soul, would be sufficient for your happiness. Again, Epicurus could say something similar, but for Epicurus, we understand he's talking about some sort of mental discipline. For Stoics, again, it's less clear for me what they're talking about. But let's go back to the article. Their solution takes radical course of diminishing such alleged goods from the account of happiness because they are not necessary for virtue and are, in fact, not in any way good at all. So things like, we'll talk about how health and wealth for Stoics are not in any way good. They will call them preferred indifference. We'll talk about this in a second. They argue that health, pleasure, beauty, strength, wealth, good reputation, and noble birth are neither good nor bad, since they can be used well or badly, and the good is invariably good. These assets are not good. The virtues, however, are good, since they are perfections of our rationality, and only rationally perfected thoughts and decisions can possibly have the features of harmony and order in which goodness itself consists. Again, it would be interesting to compare the Stoics to the Epicureans. I think the Epicureans would say that health and pleasure and beauty and strength, these things are good in themselves. Trouble, and then if you are healthy, that's good. But if you misuse your health, you add something bad to what is intrinsically good. And the Stoics want to say no. Good is an indifferent. It may be a preferred indifferent, but if it can be used for ill, then it's ill. And again, I'm sorry to keep pushing my own opinion, but I just find Stoic position implausible. But let's maybe I should let the article do the talking. Anyway, the virtues, however, since possessing and exercising virtue is happiness, happiness does not include such things as health, pleasure, and wealth. Still, the Stoics do not dismiss these assets altogether, since they still have some sort of value. And again, notice for Aristotle, pleasure is supposed to be a byproduct, a dividend of a happy life. And for Cyrenaics and for Epicureans, pleasure, is constituent of good life. Virtue is a means to pleasure. But for the Stoics, they say no, pleasure is neutral. And it's just like, this sounds to me dangerous. Again, from a Calliclean or from a Marxist position. Like, you lead a horrible life, your life is miserable, but somehow you tell yourself a story about how your life is actually good. Again, all of my Freudian and all of my Nietzschean bells go off immediately. Like, I find this, and again, like, sort of, don't take my word for it, okay? It's like who cares about my opinion? There are philosophers in the history of Western philosophy later on who will find these positions suspect as well. On the other hand, I have to tell you that Stoicism works very well with the monotheistic traditions, with the monotheistic Abrahamic traditions, such as Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, and especially the Christians, as far as I can tell, will be very fond of the Stoic philosophies. Anyway, still, and also, let me mention something. So, even though we'll keep coming back to the Epicureans, and to some extent to the Cynics, I don't really think that any of the modern philosophers we're going to talk about have anything really good to say about the Stoics. So our six thinkers, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Mill, Hegel, and Marx, all of them have problems with Stoicism. Definitely, John Stuart Mill has a lot of good things to say about the Stoics, but sort of, I think he uses Stoics against their own will. So it's like he reads the Stoics in an Epicurean fashion. As a good Epicurean, he wants to learn from the Stoics the techniques that are going to make us happy. But, well, anyway, we'll come back to this question later on. Anyway, still, the Stoics do not dismiss. So I would say that Mill reads Stoics in an Epicurean fashion, and that's fine. But Stoics, for their own right, the only philosopher who's going to have something to say about them is probably going to be Marx, who's going to criticize them as as an ideology of the slave-holding Roman Republic or the Roman Empire, right? Again, I don't mean to be too bleak. Again, I think it's important to have dialogue. I think it's important to see the virtue in every argument, and I'm sure that it is possible to defend the Stoic position. Unfortunately, I am not the best person to do this. So my bias is up front. I'm unfortunately not particularly sympathetic to the Stoic picture. Anyway, still, the Stoics do not dismiss these assets altogether. So health, pleasure, happy, and wealth, they do not dismiss them altogether. Since they have some sort of value. These things are indifferent to happiness in that they do not add to one's virtue nor detract from it, and so they do not add or take away from one's possession of the good. One is not more virtuous because healthy, nor less virtuous because ill. But being healthy generally conforms with nature's plans, for the lives of animals and plants. So it is preferable to be healthy. And again, so the phrase is preferred indifferent. So health is indifferent, but it's a preferred indifferent. So it's preferable to be healthy, and one should try to preserve and maintain one's health. Health, then, is a kind of value they call a preferred indifferent, but it is not in any way a good, and it makes no contribution to the quality of one's life as a good or a bad one, happy or miserable. In order to understand the Stoic claims about the relation of virtue to happiness, we can begin with virtue. Chrysippus, who's one of the Zeno of Citium is the founder of Stoicism, and Chrysippus is an early important exponent and systematizer of the Stoic doctrine. Chrysippus says that virtue is a craft, techne, having to do with the things of life. In other texts, we learn that the things of life include impulse. Each animal has an impulse for self-preservation. It has an awareness of its constitution and strives to preserve its integrity. There's also a natural impulse to care for offspring. Humans then are naturally inclined towards preserving life, health, and children. Although these things are not good in themselves, because only virtue is good in itself. Kant is going to have a similar position to the Stoics. But then, grown-up humans also do these things under the guidance of reason. Reason, in the adult human case, is the craftsman of impulse. This latter phrase is significant because it implies that just following natural impulse is not enough. So just following natural impulse is not enough. In fact, so again, to be properly human for the Stoics is to be guided by reason, and again, in a fashion which is different from but also similar to Aristotle. Unlike Epicureans, for whom reason only has an instrumental value. And again, when we get to Hobbes, for Hobbes also reason has only instrumental value, and it helps us bring about greater amount of pleasure through rational calculation. Anyway, in fact, it is not even possible for adult human, whose nature is such as to do everything they do by reason, even to follow the sort of natural impulses that animals and immature humans do in their actions. In order to lead a virtuous life, reason must shape our impulses and guide their expression in action. There are some nuances I don't want to go into right now because I want us to get the broad brushstrokes, broad understanding of the Stoic doctrine. But the Stoic doctrine is very developed and very nuanced in general. Impulse is the key to understanding the relation between virtue and happiness. An impulse is a propositional attitude that by itself leads to action. For example, I should eat this bread now. However, impulses do not come from a separate non-rational part of the soul. Stoics deny that there are any non-rational desires of appetite capable of impelling action. So in this sense, Stoics are very close to Socrates, this intellectualism about virtue. If you really know what is the right thing to do, you will do the right thing. I think this is the Stoic position, as far as I can tell. The soul, insofar as it provides motivation and is the cause of our action, consists of the commanding faculty, which is also reason. We can distinguish correct impulses into those we can distinguish correct impulses into those which treat virtue as the only good and those which treat things indifferent as indifferent. By contrast, emotions or passions are incorrect impulses that treat what is indifferent as good. So reason is good, and reason aims at virtue, and reason understands that health and wealth are indifferent, whereas emotions or passions are incorrect impulses, and they treat what is indifferent as good. And again, my question is, why do we disregard the natural impulse? What is the exact reason to disregard natural impulse? Again, the Epicureans are going to say, naturally we do what feels good, and the Epicureans would say that in the absence of any argument to the contrary, that's what we're gonna do, right? And David Hume and Thomas Hobbes and John Stuart Mill are gonna agree with this position, with the Epicurean position, not with the Stoic position. Anyway, so however, they do not come from a non-rational part of the soul, but are false judgments about the good. False judgments about the good. So this should remind us again. Stoic doctrine here should remind us about. Of Socrates, right? That all vice comes from ignorance, again, in this case, false judgment. Emotions such as desire, fear, pleasure, and pain embody such erroneous judgments. For instance, the desire for health is the impulse that embodies the false judgment that health is a good, instead of proper characterization of health as a preferred indifferent. The sage, someone perfect in virtue, would have no emotions in this sense, no feelings that carried him beyond reason's true assessment. He would, however, experience feelings attuned to reason, eupatheia, literally good emotions or feelings. For instance, he would feel joy over his virtue, but not pleasure. The latter being an emotion that treats actual possession of indifferent as a good. Not sure. If eupatheia is joy in the Epicurean sense, then it's not clear to me what's the difference between Stoics and Epicureans. If it's something else, then I'm not sure how exactly you justify that. Problem. This is, I think, a problem. Anyway, knowledge then about what is good, bad, and indifferent is the heart of virtue. By the way, so I'm doing something exactly the reverse of the way history of philosophy is usually taught. Usually people compare Stoics to Epicureans to show how Epicureans are base and ignoble and immoral, but the Stoics are good and nice. I am doing the reverse. Anyway, so again, I apologize. You don't have to agree with my position by all means. I'm trying to be aware of my biases, also trying to think through the issues. But at the end of the day, again, the argument is what is really important. In the courses that I teach, I don't expect the students to agree with me, but we need to develop good arguments. And in fact, who knows? Maybe you'll change my mind. Maybe you'll explain to me why my position is wrong. I have changed my views in the past, especially in reaction to fruitful dialogues with colleagues, but also sometimes with students. Anyway, knowledge then about what is good, bad, and indifferent is the heart of virtue. Courage simply is knowledge of what is to be endured. So again, this Socratic idea that knowledge is virtue, and for the Stoics, virtue is sufficient for happiness, whereas all vice comes from ignorance. Anyway, so courage is simply the knowledge of what is to be endured, the impulse to endure or not, and the only impulse that is needed by courage then follows automatically as a product or aspect of that knowledge. This tight unity in the soul is the basis for the Stoic teaching about the unity of virtues. Again, unity of virtues, like for the Stoics as for Socrates. And again, the Stoics regarded Socrates as one of their forefathers, as one of their founding fathers, proponents of the doctrine. Zeno, the founder of the school, defines wisdom, or rather practical knowledge, in matters requiring distribution as justice, in matters requiring choice as moderation, and in matters requiring endurance as courage. So there is one virtue, wisdom, which can be manifested as justice or as moderation or as courage, but it's one and the same. Practical knowledge then is a single comprehensive knowledge of what is good and bad in each of these kinds of circumstances. Attending to this identification of virtue and practical knowledge is a good way to understand the central Stoic teaching that virtue is living in agreement with nature. Virtue is living in agreement with nature. Stoics also had a lot of good things to say about the Cynics. Nature includes not only what produces natural impulses, but also the rest of the government of the cosmos by the natural world. The cosmos, the natural world. The universe is governed by right reason that pervades everything. So the universe. So you see, again, this is a teleological view. The universe is governed by right reason that pervades everything and directs or causes the way it functions. So there's deep rationality. Again, this teleological, not like the Epicurean, not like the mechanistic Epicureans, not this abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. No, but the universe is deeply rational, and everything that happens for a good reason, right? The reason directs, causes the way everything functions, with the exception of the only rational animals. There are adult human beings. So adult human actions are caused by their own individual decisions. Okay, these are problems of free will. I'm not sure I want to go into right now. Nature is even identified with Zeus, or later for the Christian Stoics with Yahweh, I would suppose, who is said to be the director of the administration of all that has being, right? So of everything that exists. Since reason governs the universe for the good, everything that happens of necessity and for the overall good. Again, problematic position. Is that really true? How do you solve the problem of evil? The Epicurean problem we talked about in the last lecture. Virtue then includes understanding both one's individual nature as a human being and the way nature arranges the whole universe. This understanding is the basis for living in agreement with the government of the universe, that is to say with nature, by making one's decisions and actions be such as to agree with Zeus's or nature's own plan, as far as one can understand what those are. And again, notice I kept talking in the lecture on Epicureans how I am suspicious of the divine command theory of morality, and to the extent that we can. I mean, I don't think that Stoics in any straightforward fashion subscribe to the divine command theory of morality, but there's certainly something of that kind. Again, sort of that there's a plan of Zeus or the plan of nature, and our purpose is to live in accordance with nature. Again, this strikes me as morally problematic. Again, it is in this context that we can best understand the Stoic teaching about indifference, such as health and wealth. An individual's health is vulnerable to being lost if right reason that governs the universe requires it for the good of the whole. So again, this idea that all is best, in this best of all possible worlds. You wake up in the morning with a crippling disease through no fault of your own. This is according to Zeus's plan. This is according to God's plan. Again, I think from a political standpoint, a deeply problematic notion. If happiness depended on having these assets and avoiding their opposites, then in these cases, happiness would be impossible. However, if virtue is living in agreement with nature's government of the universe, and if virtue is the only good, one's happiness is not vulnerable to being lost. So if virtue is sufficient for happiness, then losing one's health or wealth, this does nothing to us to diminish our happiness, right? If one understands that the good of the whole dictates that in a particular case one's health must be sacrificed, then one recognizes that his happiness does not require health. We should not, however, see this recognition as tantamount to renunciation. If the Stoic notion of happiness has any relation at all to the ordinary sense, renunciation cannot be a part of it. So I would imagine the idea is that we should try to get health and wealth as preferred indifference, but the most important our most important goal, overriding goal, should be attaining virtue. But again, you see, health and wealth are indifferent, but they are preferred indifference. So you should prefer to have health rather than to not have health, even though health is not necessary for happiness. If the Stoic notion of happiness has rather the Stoic view of living in accordance with nature should imply not only understanding the way right reason rules the universe, but agreeing with it. We can best appreciate the notion that virtue is the good then if we take the virtue as both acknowledging that the universe is well governed and adopting the point of view, so to speak, of the government. Again, you see that we keep talking about how this right reason governs the universe. See, this is the definition of political conservatism. Hegel says, was vernünftig ist, das ist wirklich, und was wirklich ist, das ist vernünftig. What is real is already rational, and what is rational becomes real. And this, again, this is a deeply, deeply conservative view. Again, we have seen something like this in Aristotle. If there are slaves in the world, this must be in accordance with the law of the universe, right? If people are slaves, if women are subordinated, if there's racism and genocide, it means this is Zeus's will. At least that seems to be the implication. Again, bracketing out the questions of free will, these are always complicated questions. Anyway, a refinement of the Stoic approach to indifference gives us a way of understanding what living in agreement with nature might look like. After all, such things as health and wealth cannot just be dismissed, since they are something like the raw material of virtue. So health and wealth are raw material of virtue. Not virtue itself, but they can help one be virtuous. I suppose that's the meaning, right, of this raw material analogy. It is in pursuing and using them that one exercises virtue. For instance, in the attempt to integrate preferred indifference into the pursuit of the good, Stoics use an analogy with archery. The archer aims to hit the target. The archer does everything in his power to hit the target. Trying everything in his power reflects the idea that such factors as a gust of wind, chance happenings that cannot be controlled or foreseen, can intervene and keep the archer from hitting the target, right? So, but what your goal in life is not to hit the target as an archer, but to try your best. And as long as you've tried your best, you've done everything that you needed to. You are happy, you are virtuous. That's enough. Hitting the target, this is Zeus's will to send you the right kind of wind and not to send an earthquake at the exact time that you release an arrow or something like that. This does not depend on you. Factors beyond your control. And Aristotle wants to say factors beyond your control have an influence on your happiness, and the Stoics want to say no, only factors within your control are important for happiness. To account for the factors, it is claimed that the goal of the archer is really trying everything in his power to attain the end. The analogy with the art of living focuses on the shift from the goal of hitting the target to the goal of trying everything in one's power to hit the target. It is the art of trying everything in one's power to attain such preferred indifference, such as health and wealth. However, if right reason, which governs the universe, decides that one will not have either health or wealth, then the sage follows right reason. And acquiesces in not having health or wealth and is still happy. At this point, the analogy with the archery breaks down, since for the sage, trying everything in one's power does not mean striving until one fails. Rather, it means seeking preferred indifference guided by right reason. By this reasoning, one should see that virtue and happiness are not identified with achieving health and wealth, but with the way one seeks them. Finally, the art of living is best compared to such skills as acting or dancing. Okay, this last point is less important. But again, you try your best, like do what you must, happen what may. You try your best, and the outcome is in Zeus's hands. The Stoics are extreme eudaimonists compared to Plato and Aristotle. While Plato clearly associates virtue and happiness, he never squarely faces the issue whether happiness may require other goods, such as health or wealth. So Plato is ambiguous on this point. Plato does not really face the issue. Aristotle holds happiness to be virtuous activity of the soul, but he raises without solving the problem of bodily and external goods and happiness, right? So for these two, virtue together with its active exercise is the dominant and most important component of happiness. So for Plato and Aristotle, virtue together with its active exercise is the dominant and most important component of happiness. But not all of it. Dominant, most important, but not all of it. While for Stoics, it simply is happiness. Stoics simply identify virtue and happiness, and so make it the only thing needed for a happy life. Still, Stoics do not reduce happiness to virtue, as though happiness is just a name for being perfectly just, courageous, and moderate. Rather, they have independent ways of describing happiness. Okay, this is interesting. This is probably, I'm not exactly sure what we're driving at. Following Zeno, all the Stoics say it is a good flow of life. Happiness is a good flow of life. Seneca says that happy life is peacefulness and constant tranquility. Interesting. Now we're speaking Epicurean language. So what is it? Is it virtue or peacefulness and constant tranquility? Is virtue the end in itself, or is peacefulness and constant tranquility the end in itself? Again, please understand, even in ancient times, Stoics and Epicureans were in constant dialogue, in constant competition, conversation, argument with one another. So I'm just reproducing this argument here. However, we should keep in mind that while the Stoics do not reduce happiness to virtue, their account of happiness is not that of common person. So they redefine what happiness is. So in recommending virtue because it secures happiness, the Stoics are relying on happiness in a special, although not completely idiosyncratic sense. In fact, the Stoic idea of happiness shares an important feature with Epicureans, right? Which puts a premium on tranquil pleasures, right? In Stoicism as well, deliverance from the vicissitudes of faith leads to a notion of happiness that emphasizes tranquility. And this is basically what John Stuart Mill is going to take from the Stoics. It's like, again, reading the Stoics in an Epicurean fashion, taking, ataraxia, this pleasurable state of tranquil pleasures, constant peacefulness and tranquility, taking that to be the goal of life and not virtue per se. Taking virtue as instrumental. This is what Mill is going to do to the Stoics. And as well, we shall see tranquility is a value for the skeptics. Yes, we'll talk about the skeptics later on. Again, ataraxia is also the goal of the skeptic enterprise. Clearly, the Stoic account of virtue and happiness depends on their theory about human nature. For Aristotle, virtue is perfection of human function. And the Stoics follow this line of thinking. While their notion of virtue builds on their notion of the underlying human nature, their account of the perfection of human nature is more complex than that of Aristotle. It includes accommodation of nature, of the nature of the universe. Virtue is the perfection of human nature that makes it harmonious with the workings of faith, that is to say, with Zeus's overall plan, regarded as the ineluctable cause of what happens in the world at large. And again, you can see here certain ideas which are, broadly speaking, consonant with philosophical monotheism, right? So the Stoics are going to talk about a single logos that governs the universe, the single right reason, which can be identified with the will of Zeus. And in this sense, the Neoplatonists and Pythagoreans, but also the Stoics, with their, monotheistic elements of their philosophy, pave the way for philosophical Christianity later down the line. Okay, and I am going to finish the segment on the Stoics here. Next time we'll talk about the skeptics. Again, I apologize for being so critical of the Stoics every step of the way. Well, to some extent, I'm just being honest. because I am unfortunately skeptical of the Stoic enterprise, and I find it suspect from broadly speaking Marxist perspective. But I encourage everyone to take my position with a grain of salt. Nobody says that I have to be right. Maybe a year or a couple will pass and I will change my mind. Who knows? Again, the value of philosophy is argument and discussion, right? And not reaching fixed conclusions. But I did try to maybe be slightly more polemical in order to also help you understand the distinctive features of the Stoic doctrine. Okay, so in any case, I hope you found this stimulating. If the Stoics are your favorite philosophy, I hope that you did not find this too offensive, and I hope you do have some insightful counter arguments. In that case, I would be more than happy to hear them. Again, discussion is always more than welcome. And who knows, maybe at the end of the day, again, remember, the only force that a free citizen recognizes is the peculiarly unforced force of the better argument. Der zwanglosen Zwang des besseren Arguments, right? So in any case, I hope this was insightful and stimulating. So I will see you in the next segment when we talk about the skeptics. And until then, take care.